afternoon. My name is Johanna Mendelson Forman. I'm an adjunct professor here at the School of International Service and much honored to be included in this wonderful conference about food, Israeli cuisine as a reflection of modern society. For me, this is especially meaningful for a couple of reasons, one of which is 3 years ago I started a project here called the Conflict Cuisine Project about how diasporas in Washington were so important in creating a food culture that many people said was, you could always tell where United States was at war by what new restaurants opened. And in fact, I mean, to this day, I think the reflection of our own politics and our own community is we don't have as many ethnic restaurants opening because we've closed our borders. And so where we do have a few Iraqi cuisines and a few Syrian chefs and a few people who get into this country on visas, it's much less important today than it was in the days after the Vietnam War and then the Afghanistan population that came in, and followed by that the Ethiopian. I don't know, how many of you know that Washington is the second largest city after Addis of Ethiopia? We have 250,000 Ethiopians living in Washington metropolitan area. The same with Central Americans. After the war in Central America, we have after Los Angeles, we're the second largest population. So we are a city of diasporas. So when I was really honored to be asked by Laura Cutler and to be a participant in this event, I said, how appropriate, and did I not realize what I was getting myself into when the topic was Israeli Arab food politics? Well, of course, this raises the importance of food as political identity. And today we have with us a group of scholars and a practitioner who, more than other groups, define the question that someone raised in the last panel about what about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and what does this mean, and how is food a manifestation of it? Well, if you waited through lunch, which was a wonderful lunch, and I think we ought to give people a round of applause for that wonderful lunch, you will see today that there is a lot of politics behind the food you eat, but also a much more solid theoretical and expert academic basis for understanding the meaning of this in the context of Israel's population, in the context of its statehood. And I think with this excellent group of both scholars and practitioners, we can get beyond what I would say are the very hackneyed conversations about who owns hummus, of which there are many conversations, and about the creation of the nation state. I think as I was reading the material, I said, imagine if this conference were taking place at the Conference of Westphalia. What would the cuisines and contours of Europe look like if it would be a very different culinary terroir than we see today? So actually, dealing with a country like Israel and the nature of Israeli Arab food politics builds on the work that I've always felt very important, its relationship to international relations. And I meant it when I said that the kitchen has become the new venue of foreign policy, and indeed the case of Israel and its neighbors in terms of food as a microcosm for the study of how food is central to the creation of a nation, and conversely what it means in the absence of a nation, is really an important part of the dynamic we're seeing today. So I'm not going to talk a lot, something that you'll find very unusual. I am going to let my panelists present some wonderful observations, starting with my colleague to my left, Ronald Ranta. You have his full biography in the brochure, but he is a scholar, just to let you know, of food and nationalism, and he provides another approach to how globalization has affected the way we eat and how we seek out food. And he talks about attention rising from the ways in which cultures brand food and the use of their cuisine as a tool of soft power that adds another dimension to history. So beyond that, I turn the floor over to Ronald, who has a wonderful presentation. So please.
Okay. So a lot of questions have asked about the relationship with Arab and Palestinian and Israeli cuisine, so I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm going to go directly to those questions. So before that, just quickly saying thank you to Laura, to Susan and Michael for inviting me, and thank you very much for coming. Now, we can all agree that Israeli food is great, and that food in Israel is great. And as one of the consequences, one of the main things we look forward when visiting Israel is eating. And of course, we do that with a kind of mild sense of trepidation and some kind of fear that we might overeat, so overindulge in food and gain too much weight. I know me, myself in particular, with that regard. And it's partly because the food is very affordable and very easy to find great food, and also because Israelis eat everywhere. at work, at home, at the beach, in the street, which also adds this idea of you wanting to eat more. Now, as someone who lived in Israel in the 80s and 90s, I remember a time where Israeli food was not that impressive. And the culinary scene in Israel is not very impressive. We talked today about Israeli food and food culture. We're mostly talking about what happened in the last 2 decades because of globalization. Now, there's always a few good places to eat, but this is really a recent phenomena. We have a wide range of new restaurants, new cuisines, innovation to Israeli cuisines, rise of new chefs, which some of them we already met. One of the things I find most interesting in this kind of new phenomena is the recent emergence of an Arab culinary scene in Israel. Now, there have always been Arab restaurants in Israel, but they mostly serve the standard fare of hummus, salads, fries, and grilled meats. These days, we're witnessing numerous new, innovative, modern Arab restaurants. Arab chefs on television, Arab contestants on Israel's version of MasterChef, one even winning Israel's version of MasterChef. We're talking about Arab cookbooks, one of very few cultural items Arabs produce, which are now sold in Israeli book shops, which is quite unusual. I mean, I normally don't bring a very, very extensive presentation because I'm always weary that technology might fail me. So I bought something which is not too complicated, and if it didn't work, it wouldn't be the end of the world. This is an image of the Arab Nazareth-based restaurant Diana, which has a number of franchises in Israel. So this one is one from the town of Yokneam, but they also have a number of other franchises, one of them in downtown Tel Aviv. And if you had told me 20, 30 years ago, an Arab restaurant with several Jewish partners would open in downtown Tel Aviv and calling it Israeli kosher grill, I'd be very, very surprised by that. Now, so much so has this kind of trend developed that we also have Arab companies. If you think about tchina in Israel, most of the tchina produced in Israel is produced by Arab companies in Israel. So they're selling Arab products under their own labels in Israeli supermarkets. Again, a very unusual thing. And even more unusual than that, you have Israeli companies selling their products, now calling it openly Arab, as a sign of how good it is and how authentic it is. So this is an Israeli company called Tzabar, one of Israel's leading salad producers. The name itself, Tzabar, is quite heavy with meaning. Selling its hummus under the title of the Kings of Hummus. So we have Abu Samir's hummus and Abu Marwan's hummus, and there's many, many others. And the whole project called the Nihad, the Jordanian range of hummus. Now, this phenomena is particularly interesting given the current state of Israeli-Palestinian relations, the ongoing occupation, the fact that food is one of very few examples of an Arab cultural product which has made its way into, knowingly, the Israeli society. Not only that, it's acknowledged, it's also celebrated to an extent, which is also very unusual. And this last point is very important to think about, because in Israel, calling something Arab has rarely denoted a sign of quality, and that is an understatement. There's also one of the more important reasons why this phenomenon is particularly interesting is also the history of Arab food in Israel. So we've spoken about, in the previous panel, about the very wide range of influences and images of Israeli food. And indeed, if you think about what Israeli eat at home, there's a wide range of food items coming from multiple destinations, diaspora groups. Also, what they eat depends on levels of religiosity, on ethnicity, class, among many other factors. And if you go through Israeli cookbooks, you find acknowledgement of many of these influences, from Mizrahi food to Sephardic, to Balkan, to Ashkenazi, to American food. And they're openly analyzed and discussed. However, if we think of what we think of as Israeli food, and if I'd asked you previously to do a survey of what Israeli food is, and if you think of what Israelis consider as Israeli food, and what Israelis sell abroad as Israeli food, or what others consider as Israeli food, what is interesting is that many of these food items have their origin in an Arab and Palestinian kitchen. Now, it's very interesting reading through Israeli cookbooks and food writing about the contributors and contributions to Israeli society and Israeli food culture. They provide kind of an indication that discourse is going on in Israel. And of course, they highlight all these different contributions, particularly the Mizrahi contribution, the Ashkenazi contribution, the impact of globalization. But if you read through Israeli cookbooks, read Israeli food writing, watch Israeli food programs, until very recently, there was no mention of an Arab or Palestinian influence. And there's a number of different layers to this omission. One of the most glaring is the presentation of Arab and Palestinian food items as part of Mizrahi Jewish culture, and therefore they're Jewish, but not Arab Jewish. Other layers are the idea that these products, food cultures, are biblical, and therefore Arab Palestinians simply preserved ancient Jewish traditions, and therefore borrowing it back actually means nothing. But they held our traditions, and now we're basically taking that back from us. Yeah, back for us. Yeah. There's a few other ideas that even if you'd admit, well, there is an Arab element, no one would mention a Palestinian element. And the way some of the chefs who mentioned it up till now on different panels here, like Michael, is an exception to this point. Now, this failure, either by design or by default, to mention Arab and Palestinian people and their contribution is prevalent and present in most Israeli cookbook. And in fact, until very recently, you'd be hard-pressed even to find the word Arab or Palestinian in any Israeli cookbooks. And when they do appear, someone mentioned Ottolenghi a few panels ago. His book, Jerusalem, which has amazing food in it, provides a very sanitized and bland idea of what Jerusalem is, a very idealized version of Jerusalem. This is not Jerusalem if you go to visit it right now. Particularly if you went to East Jerusalem, this is not the Jerusalem you'd encounter. Now, this state of affair of the kind of denial of an Arab-Palestinian contribution is striking when you think of how important Arab food and Palestinian food have been in terms of the restaurants people go to, the terminology they use, the dishes, the items, the daily life and culture in Israel, and the fact that so many dishes of leading Israeli Jewish chefs are Arab and Palestinian. So much so that up till recently, everyone talked about Israeli salad. Now people talk about the Arab salad. And when several top Israeli chefs were asked, what is Israel's national dish? They said, Israel's national dish is Arab salad. Yeah. I mean, an example is the issue of how something which was or is Arab Palestinian becomes Israeli. And I give you even another one in terms of cookbooks. This is a cookbook put by the Israeli embassies in the US titled Beyond Milk and Honey, and describes one of Israel's most famous dish, falafel. So falafel is sold on street corners in every city and town in Israel. Some call it the Israeli Hamburger. Its popularity can be attributed to the small part of the Yemenite Jews who have brought a particularly tasty version onto the culinary scene. Now, for anyone who knows anything about Yemenite food, falafel was not consumed widely in Yemen, and Yemen did not bring falafel to Israel. It is true that many falafel places in Israel were run by Yemenite Jews, but they didn't bring the falafel with them. Now, we can talk about two important historical processes that have shaped, if you want, Israeli attitudes towards Arab and Palestinian food. On the one hand, the transformation of a settler society into a native society necessitated the appropriation of indigenous culture. And this is true to most settler colonial society. Think about American food and the importance of corn, of squash, of beans to it. Now, the construction of a native Israeli food culture was based, to an extent, on the fascination leading to adaptation, imitation, and appropriation of Arab and Palestinian culinary items. At the same time, it also went through a process of de-Arabizing its culinary scene, of omitting or failing to mention any of these Arab and Palestinian contributions. Now, this process of adaptation leading to appropriation has been recognized by many Israeli and other scholars. Particularly if you read about the first and the second Aliyah in Israel, the way they dressed, the way they spoke, what they ate, the way they danced, what they sang. What I argue is that it didn't end in 1948, as some scholars would say. It is an ongoing process. Now, stories of hummus and falafel are quite well known, but there's many other Palestinian items which have made this transition from being Palestinian now to becoming Israelis. Knafe is a really interesting example because you asked the question earlier about social media. There was a whole social media debate about knafe. This is from BuzzFeed a few years ago, which simply asked, what are Israel's main desserts? And one of the things BuzzFeed came up with is knafe. Now, knafe is something eaten across the region, but this particular version of knafe nabalsiya, particularly with the red dye, is very, very specific to Palestine and to Palestine and to the city of Nablus. Now, this idea, of cultural appropriation, I think is very clearly shown in an advertisement to an Israeli car rental company called Eldan, calling itself a white and blue car rental company, white and blue the colors of the flag, which I came across at Ben-Gurion's airport a few years ago, showing three prominent Palestinian cultural images, the Jaffa orange, the prickly pear, and the falafel becoming Israeli. So much so that most Israelis would ask me, what has anything to do with Palestine? Prickly pear, oranges, Palestine? It is moved now completely and is now Israeli. or at least seen as Israeli by Israelis. Now, I don't want to essentialize Palestinian culture of food and say, this is Palestinian food. Of course, many Palestinian chefs I've spoken to said Palestinian food is varied, it's part of the regional food culture, but the encounter of many Israelis with this food happened in Palestine through Palestinians. Now, if these products eventually are Ottoman is beside the point. So what's going on here? On the one hand, celebrating Arab culture, on the one hand, appropriating it. And there's several different ways of understanding this phenomena. So I've written a book about food and nationalism and the impact of globalization. So there's a number of food-related trends which are important here. But I want to skip those and talk about the kind of political dimensions which are important in the Arab-Israeli conflict to understand this issue. So several leading scholars on food have said that adapting and incorporating ethnic or migrant food into the national food culture is a useful mechanism of subduing and domesticating a threatening space. And it leads, this is not a process of inclusion or providing social mobility to a minority, but of essentializing and exoticizing and marginalizing the other. In other words, the recent, if you want, celebration of Arab food has little to do with the acceptance of the other, but in fact a product of a Jewish Israeli society that is so secure and confident in its total domination, cultural, societal, economic and political, over Palestinians, whether in Israel or the West Bank or Gaza, that it's capable now to choose and appropriate things in a kind of very open way. And doing so in a very transparent way, as example of the knafa, if you want the example of the za'atar, which is now also Israeli. Now, this way of looking at Israeli society definitely fits in with some of with the Israeli ongoing occupation and appropriation of Palestinian land, its depiction as an ethnic majoritarian democracy and an ethno-national state, with some discriminatory laws, particularly targeted at Palestinians, but also against non-Jews in Israel, with the migrant worker, asylum seekers, and others. Also fits in well with some of the xenophobic kind of policy making and laws put forward in the Israeli Knesset. Now, I didn't want to end in this kind of really pessimistic note. So even though the second analysis I provide you is one which most of my colleagues think is naive and overly optimistic, the late Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish once said that in a time in the future, in a time of reconciliation between Jews and Arabs, for those who asked about conflict resolution and food, the Jew will not be ashamed to find an Arab element in himself, and the Arab will not be ashamed to declare that he incorporates Jewish elements. And let me build on this insight and provide another way of analyzing this. Now, food, as Orit Rosen has mentioned earlier, has been used as a marker of Jewish Israeli national identity and boundary-making setting mechanism. But the fact that in recent years there is a willingness to acknowledge Arab, sometimes also Palestinian food, within Jewish Israeli culture and society, I would say is therefore culturally, historically important and significant, and not just as a way of depoliticizing the food of the other. Because this is a willingness not simply to eat some new exotic food, but eating a food of the other which you thought initially as belonging to yourself, to your culture, to your history, and to your pride. In other words, at least a segment of the Jewish Israeli population, and most people know, I guess, which segment I'm talking about, has been willing to consider and identify with the Arab other, and to some extent the Palestinian other in themselves, and or at least with regards to the food culture. Now, as noted by Israeli sociologist Uri Ram, these two paradigms don't contradict each other. You can see that Israel has witnessed a shift in nationalism as a consequence of globalization. On the one hand, a renewed nationalist drive fueled by xenophobia and religion. And on the other hand, a gradual shift away from ethnocentric view of Israel towards viewing Israel as a country of all its people. And these two can be seen as complementary. The recent celebration of Arab food, as well as the growing visibility of Arab and Palestinians in Israeli society, in television, in Israeli media, in cookbooks, is forcing Israelis to acknowledge their presence and deal with it. Now, this acknowledgement brings about both a rejection on the one hand and confrontation of Palestinian culture, social aspiration, political aspiration, by those who view them as a threat and view the idea of coexistence as a threat, while on the other hand, generating acceptance by those within Israel who'd welcome a more pluralistic and inclusive society. Because if you want, at the heart of this debate or process about Israeli food is a struggle to define what constitutes Israeli culture and national identity and what the boundaries of it are. Thank you very much.
So Ronald, thank you for setting this up and for asking the question whether food unites or divides people and how it affects national identity. Our next speaker, as you will see on your program, is Nir Avieli of the Ben-Gurion University. And I don't know, are you going to give us an optimistic view, or are you going to give us the realpolitik?
I'll try to be amusing. Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you for introducing me. And I want to thank the organizers for bringing almost everyone who does research on Israeli food. I don't know how you did it. Almost all of us are here. This is really an exceptional moment. And relating to what Ronald said, I think 50% of the Israeli left are now here. Is this optimistic enough? So I want to give a mirror image. A mirror image point of view to Ronald's presentation. I want to talk about the moments when Israelis say that actually they don't like Palestinian food, or the moment when they don't identify with Palestinian food. So this is my main argument, or my main goal in this paper. So this is a chapter, or part of a chapter of a book that is coming out that I've written on Israel. I never meant to write this book. It wrote itself. I was teaching and taking students on tours, and suddenly I realized that I have these ethnographic vignettes, one next to the other, and then I compiled them into a book that is coming out soon. And I want to start with a phenomena that I thought was striking. When I was thinking about what is the most popular food in Israel, and I was trying to think which one is the most popular food in Israel, I realized that Italian food is the food that Israeli love the most. Now, when you say something like this, you have to prove it. So, you know, anthropologists don't count. You know this saying. So we rarely count. But I've used this very dodgy methodology. I've used internet websites. The numbers are not important. What is important, as you will see in this table, is that the scales, the ratios, are confirmed themselves. So the relation between the number of Italian restaurants and other kinds of restaurants in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and throughout the country are similar. So if you look at the table, you'll see that Jerusalem has 56 Italian restaurants and pizzerias. It has 13 Asian restaurants, but remember that Asians in Israel include Chinese, Indian, Thai, Japanese, and the most popular is those pan-Asian restaurants that have, you know, you have tuk-tuk and rickshaw and, you know, these places that serve marked ethnic food. And the other category that comes close to Italian restaurants is the so-called Mizrahi restaurants. This is a very complex category. I'm not going to unpack this parcel here because it might explode, but just to make a point, it includes Lebanese, Iraqi, Kurdish, Yemenite, Moroccan, as well as falafel and shawarma places. So there is more Italian restaurants and pizzerias in Jerusalem than any other category. Tel Aviv, different numbers, but look at the ratios, very similar. There is more Italian restaurants and pizzerias in Tel Aviv than there are Mizrahi restaurants and falafel stands. And if you look at the whole country again, the proportions are quite similar. So from this table, no matter if the numbers are accurate or not, the proportions are important. Israelis prefer Italian restaurants and pizzerias over any other kind of food, inclusive of Mizrahi food, inclusive of falafel. Now, the most popular food establishment in Israel is the cafe. And about 50% of Israeli food establishments are cafes. Cafes are places that you don't go to drink coffee, you actually eat. And if you look at the menus, so this is just an example, you'll see that the menus of most of these cafes have at least 50% of their items are Italian. Pizzas, pastas, Italian salads. And if you also take into consideration what Israelis cook at home. So yesterday we had a conversation and I told Yechiel, so what is the food that your children like the most? And he thought for a second, then he said, well, pasta. You know, so also at home we eat a lot of is the Israeli version of Italian food. So I'm just going to read to you a little commentary made by journalists Gil Gutkin and Shiri Maimon. If aliens visited Israel, they would be positive that pizza is our national food. There is no neighborhood in Israel without at least a single pizzeria, and usually more. Okay? Let me say a few words about how I did the research beyond this internet yellow pages sampling. I did participant observation, ethnographic participant observation in 12 restaurants in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and also in the Israeli periphery. I'm not going to talk about the orientalization of the Israeli pizza. This is a different story, but it is there too. I interviewed owners, I interviewed clients. I will keep the anonymity of everybody that I talked to, but people who went on public in the on newspapers. So I just used their names because they were fine with it. And there is also a little bit of text analysis in my text. So, you know, I conducted probably hundreds of conversations, and people tell you, and I asked them, so why do you prefer Italian food? And people would tell me zillions of explanations, but once you collect enough conversations, suddenly the things start to go into categories. So there's 4 categories that I identified. I am just going to go over the categories very quickly, but I want to make a disclaimer. It is very hard to say something serious and complex in 10 minutes. And this is the time that was allocated to me. And as a food scholar, I always face the problem of saying something that is not substantiated and then being either funny or unconvincing. So this is exactly what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to present 3 very quick arguments. Please ask me during the question time, and I will elaborate on each of the points. Okay, so the first thing has to do with size. In my book, in the first chapter, I define the Israeli cuisine. I argue that the Israeli cuisine should be identified not by taste, not by ingredients, not by this idea of, you know, a sholent bat. Israelis, what they really like is big, cheap portions. And I can explain that and prove it and show it, not now, but I'm happy to do it later. The second line of argument that people gave me had to do with dairy food, cheese, milk. In Israel, most celebratory meals have meat. But not everybody likes meat, and especially at dinner time, Israelis prefer not to eat meat. And Italian restaurants in Israel generally are, kosher or not, rarely have meat in them. So the fact that you can have dairy food that is celebratory in a nice restaurant, candles on your table, the whole thing makes them very popular. The third argument, or the third line of arguments, had to do with the Israeli family orientation. Israel is now the family with the largest average number of children in the OECD. In my echelon, social echelon, the saying is that 4 is the new 3. Yes. So I myself have 5 children. It just happened, but you know I'm surrounded. I'm surrounded by people that have 4 and 5 children. This is it. It is very common. And when I was interviewing the chefs, they told me, you know, Israelis think that Italian restaurants are children-friendly. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, they see in the American movies, yes, the Italian mama and the children running around, and she's cursing them in Italian, and everything is, you know, jolly and happy. And I said, yes. And they said, no. In Italy, nobody, you know, if a kid would be taken to the restaurant, he would be so grateful and he would sit tightly. And one of them told me, when a family calls me and they said that they want to make an order for a reservation for a birthday for a kid, they said, sorry, we are full. Actually, it was very embarrassing because I thought about my own culinary behavior in pizzerias and restaurants, and I had to admit that this is true, that we think that these places are kind of places that are friendly to naughty Israeli kids. So these are the 3 arguments I'm not going to talk about today. And let me go to my 4th argument, which I find the most interesting. And this had to do with the argument for Mediterraneanness, Yam Tichoniut in Hebrew. So let me read some quotes from my interviews. It is easy to make good Italian food here. You can find fresh ingredients of high quality the year round. So this is an Italian, not Israeli, not Jewish, Italian chef owner of a restaurant in Jerusalem. Here is another quote. Italian food in Israel is very specific. We adopted the ingredients and dishes suitable for the Israeli taste, mainly the Mediterranean and Sicilian food. The ingredients are similar, but also the temperament. It is a geographical thing. So you see, similar food, similar ecology, and perhaps similar mentality. So at first, when they started saying the things about mentality, I didn't pay much attention to it, but then it goes on and on. First and foremost, it is the proximity, the similarity between Israel and some parts of southern Italy, the Mediterranean influence, the ingredients, the olive oil. It is also about simplicity. We Mediterranean people, we. So it's us and the Italians, yes? We Mediterranean people prefer simple and immediate food. French food is too complex. We are hyperactive and we don't want to spend 10 hours cooking. So this is another, a manager of another restaurant in Italy. Where is this picture taken, you think? No, it's in Italy, yes, but yeah, but you see the point, yes, you see the confusion. So here is some text from some excerpts from a text that was published in the newspaper. It was written by journalist Rina Goldstein. She is interviewing Ronen Arditi, who is the owner of Tel Aviv Bellini, which used to be a very popular Italian restaurant. And he says, Italian food is suitable for the Israeli market because high-quality ingredients can be obtained in Israel, tomato, olive oil, and herbs such as arugula, blah, 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 blah. Then he adds, Italian food suits the Israeli beat. It's fast. The fact that one doesn't need to spend hours eating, as is common with French cuisine, makes it appropriate for the Israeli mentality. Yoram Yerzin, another active restaurant owner of Cafe Italia, said, simplicity constitutes the cultural common ground of Italians and Israelis. So you see, again and again, we and the Italians, we are similar. It's not only the ecology, it's not only olive oil and garlic, but also the temperament, the mentality, how we think about the world. So Jonas Sasson, owner of another popular Jerusalem restaurant, says shared mentality. We and the Italians share a mentality. So let me just show you the map, just very quickly. Okay? This is Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and this is Italy. The distance between Israel and Italy is over 2,500 kilometers, over 1,500 miles. Yes? Quite far. Yeah? And then I started thinking, what are these guys talking about? You know, if you want to talk about proximity, ecology, culture, and you heard what Ronald said, yes, we are using the Palestinian Arab food all the time, yes, and we like it. So why are these people telling me we are like them? Yes, so I asked them, so why are you comparing Israelis to Italians and not to those who really live next to us? So here are some things that some of the people present here said. So Yael Raviv said that falafel is considered by many as Israel's national dish. You know, this slide came about today. This is the fourth time, right? Whenever I look at it, I am thinking of an Israeli settlement, not necessarily in the occupied territories, but the whole idea of how to settle. Yeah, you go to the hills, you put a flag, it becomes yours. So there is something very, very powerful in this picture that goes well beyond falafel. Ronald, many Israeli Jews consider iconic Palestinian dishes, as you have heard, as to be Israeli and may deny that they are Palestinians. Daphna Hirsch, who I should have been here, I don't know why she's not here, she's the only one missing. She has an article called Hummus is Best When Made by Arabs. Yes, and this is again a class thing. Some upper class Israelis would say that, you know, the best hummus, you go to the Arabs and you get it there. But at the same time, Arab/Mizrahi/Palestinian cuisine is considered cheap and mundane. So one of the restaurant owners, one of the chefs that I asked about, I said, so why Italian and not Palestinians? He told me, you know, no one I know would consider celebrating a birthday party at a hummus joint or taking his girlfriend for a romantic meal at a grilled meat joint like they do in my restaurant. So you see, there is a question of prestige. Italian restaurant is romantic, it's prestigious. Palestinian food or Arab food or Mizrahi food can't do this, you know. They are simple and mundane. They are not celebratory enough. So now let me go to my argument. Basically, what I argue is that when Israeli Jews go to Italian restaurants, they imagine themselves as not being part of the Middle East, but as being part of the Mediterranean, where they would really like to be. Yes? They are in the Middle East, what can you do? But in their imagination, where they would like to be now is southern Italy. Yes? And then they tell you this story about how the mentality is similar, the ecology is similar. 2,500 miles have been compressed into, you know, a leap of words. You can say whatever you like, and then you're there in your imagination. So let me read. This is an excerpt from my book. Italian food allows for the great escape of Israeli Jews from the Middle East, where they live and where many feel trapped, to where they imagine they would fit much better. A small Italian village where the weather, landscape, plants, and aromas are just like in Israel, but where the neighbors are just like us. That is European rather than Arab. And let me just go to my last slide just to make my point and into a wider context. So here are two of my favorite politicians. These guys have been responsible for where Israel is going for the last 20 years. I like them both the same. And even though you can say that one of them was the leader of the Labour Party and the other one is the leader of the Likud Party, you need a very strong magnifying glass to find any difference between them. You know, they've been cooperating very seriously for the last 20 years. And look about what they have to say about the neighborhood. Ehud Barak, in a very famous article that he wrote for the New York Review of Books, he said that Israel is a villa in the jungle. So we live in a villa, and who is in the jungle? Yeah. Netanyahu, this is much later. This is the wall that was built on the Sinai border, but you know that Netanyahu was also the advocate of building the separation wall, which is, think how paradoxical it is. Israel says, well, the occupied territories, we keep them forever, but let's build a wall between us and the occupied territories. This is some of the paradoxes that characterize this kind of relationship. And Netanyahu says, we shall surround Israel with fences to defend ourselves against wild beasts. You see? So when I'm saying that Israelis don't want to be in the Middle East, I am climbing on very high trees. For example, these two. Am I being optimistic enough? Thanks for listening to me.
I think on the question of optimism, Nir, you'll have to wait for the audience's response. But I'll say one thing. I think the United States has a similar list where the American Restaurant Association did a survey, and Italian restaurants were still the most populous, and we have oceans separating us. But I think you're raising a much more serious point about cultural identification. But I want to let Ronit join us and sort of develop the conversation even further, because as you know, in the United States, Italian food became generic. And we don't even think about going to an Italian restaurant or having a pizza as something from another culture. We think it's ours. So the question is, what does that mean, and how does it relate to what Nir has just said? So Ronit, who you know is a food writer and a researcher and works for Haaretz, is going to tell you more.
I'm afraid I won't be the optimist that you were looking for, maybe. I usually don't write about myself in my column, but I thought I will make an exception here and share with you some of my experience as a person who loves food and as a person who writes about food and was born and raised in Israel. In August 2013, photographer Dan Peretz and me set out on a tour, on a Ramadan tour, to the city of Tira. Tira is an Arab city in the middle of Israel. As what you see here is a beautiful falafel, by the way, falafel in the Jerusalem style, filled with onions and sumac. And I don't know if you had the pleasure of seeing this beautiful sight of Ramadan in Arab city. I hope you did, because what happens a little bit before dusk, before the sun goes down and the muezzin calls for, breaking the fast, the streets are filled with stalls that sell all kinds of street foods and foods that has to do, are associated with the Ramadan. So you can see here Haj Nader. I remember him specifically because I was really touched by him. He came from Jerusalem. He's the one making the Jerusalem falafel, and his younger son with him. Their stall wasn't very popular at the time because they were new in town. And this is a more popular stand that sells falafel the way that the people in Tira are used to consume. Awame, some dough fried in in oil, very characteristic of the season as well. Katayef, one of the most famous dishes that people eat during the Ramadan times. These stalls are all in the city. And what is amazing about it is that people go and buy the food. They are still fasting, so they can't eat. It was a very good lesson for people as hungry as I am, because you have to restrain yourself. Nobody is eating in the street. Everyone is taking the food back home and waiting for the iftar, for the meal to begin. And we were guests of this wonderful woman. Her name is Fataya. We were guests at hers and her husband's house, Fatri. And she made a tremendous feast, you know. There was a laben soup with frike and a kub in it, and all kinds of stuffed food. And really, we ate so much. I remember that the title of the article was something that one of the people said next to the table. He said something like, what the eyes see during the day, the heart desires at night. So that was the headline of this article. And now I've been writing about food for a long, long time now. And I've been on Ramadan tours before. And I've been writing about Palestinian cuisine for a long time now. But this day was engraved in my heart. And the reason it was like that, because it has a combination of personal circumstances, okay? I was born on 6th of October, 1973. For Israeli people, this date, and for Egyptian people also, this date means a lot because it's the beginning of the Yom Kippur War. Now, I don't hold any significant or mystic meaning to the fact that I was born you know, when the war began or on Yom Kippur itself. But it's a bit symbolic because sometimes you feel that life in Israel is always under the shadow of war in a way. And I was raised in Kfar Hes. Kfar Hes is a small village, a small moshav, in the center of Israel as well. Actually, the closest settlement or city next to Kfar Hes, where I grew up, is Tira. And so my parents' house is about 500 meters from this people's house. And I've never been a guest in a house in Tira. And I've never met these people. And you know, when I was a child, people used to go into Tira to fix their car. That was mainly what they did. We were sent to study in school, which is 45 minutes away from the place where I grew up, you know, from my village. I never met a person my age from Tira, okay? I never spoke to any of the children over there. I don't know if you guys know Sayed Kashua, the author and also a journalist in Haaretz, but he's basically my age. We could have been great friends. I think I've never met him. So seeing all this, the traditions and the foods that were on the table, and understanding that I live just 500 meters from there, and I never had the chance to experience this part of the heritage of the people that actually were my neighbors, were like really eye-opening for me in many ways. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I love the idea of breaking bread together, and the concept that in Israel sometimes we repeat that if we will eat hummus together, everything will be okay. But I'm afraid that as long as there's a separation, a complete separation in the educational system between Jews and Arabs, you know, nothing will change in the long terms. The saddest thing is, you know, I'm third generation of the people who founded this village. My brother still lives there. I live in Tel Aviv. And his children still don't go to school with Arab children. And there are no after-school joint activities, nothing. There's a complete separation between Jews and Arabs in the state of Israel. So hummus for itself will not help, if you understand what I'm saying. I guess you all know Sami and Yotam. People spoke about them before. I just want to remind you, for example, you all know the books, the restaurants, the beautiful thing that they do. They both grew up in Jerusalem. They were both born in the same year. They actually never met each other in Jerusalem, of course. I doubt it if anything of the beautiful thing that they do would have happened unless they would go outside of Israel and meet each other in London, okay? So I interviewed them when their book, Jerusalem, came out. And I think that it's not surprising that we're sitting here today and speaking about Israeli kitchen, and this is one of the first conferences that addresses this subject very thoroughly. And it's not in Israel, it's in the United States. And it seems in recent years that it might be easier to define what is Israeli cuisine outside the borders of Israel, because inside the border of Israel, everything is a minefield in a way. You know, you get to ask all these questions. What is Israeli? What is Palestinian? Do we even need national cuisines? Do we need to define these things? And outside the borders of Israel. Sometimes it seems that you can just cook good food and, don't go to all these complex questions. So around the time that Sami's and Yotam book was published, I don't know if you know this beautiful book, it's a picture from him. It's from the Gaza kitchen. So when I interviewed Laila and Maggie, Laila Hadid and Maggie Schmidt that wrote the book, one of them told me this beautiful sentence. I asked them, a lot of questions, and one of them said, food is a significant component of identifying and creating identity for people without geography. It defines the Palestinians, connects them, and places them all on all the levels where modern maps and dictionaries fail to do so. Does this sound a bit familiar for anyone who's been writing or reading about Jewish cuisine? And of course, the Gaza kitchen is not the only one. In the last couple of years, we see a lot of Israeli and Palestinians books are being published. And the amazing thing about it, that, it's a common phenomenon in anthropology. I am the third generation. A lot of these people who publish these books are third generation. The first generation, from the Jewish side, the people that came after World War and built Israel in 1948. And in the Palestinian side, the people that had the trauma of 48, these people are still in trauma. They're trying to survive. They're trying to raise and create new life. The second generation is a little bit embarrassed about his parents. They do not want to think about the kitchen of their parents. They are pretty much still busy in surviving, okay? And third generation trying to look for the roots, I went to Poland and Russia in order to find out what my grandparents used to cook. And Palestinian people do the same, because there's this gap that two traumas that has occurred during the same time happened, and third generation people are trying to identify themselves again through the kitchen. So there are a lot of Palestinian cookbooks, just like there are a lot of Israeli cookbooks that are being published now. I've interviewed a lot of them, Jodi Kala, Rim Kassis that Michael was talking about last night. Okay, so one of the things I've been trying to do in my columns, for example, is trying to understand what was really there before 1948. And it's not an easy task to do because of the trauma, It's not easy to understand what people cooked in Acre or in Jaffa and in other places, because a lot of them, Osama, for example, this is actually Osama's grandmother, that he will talk about it maybe later, holding a dish called 3D. That is, they cook it in Acre. They probably used to cook it in other places. One of the most amazing things, of course, in trying to understand what was there before 1948, and I have to remind you that before 1948, this whole area was a joint region, like people, whether they were Jewish, Christian, or Muslims, ate the same things before there were borders. But if you want to understand what is the kitchen in Acre, for example, it would be very difficult, because there are less than 10 families that, like Osama's family, has been living there for 300 years, okay? A lot of those families from Acre are now refugees in different places. So it's kind of hard to understand what is the cuisine looked like exactly. My mission in life is to make people hungry. So again, these are from two different articles. One of them is from Acre. I think this is the dish that Osama was talking about last night, for those of you who have been here. And the right one would be a dish from Jaffa. Again, one of the things I try to do is to find dishes that are typical to the Jaffa cuisine. And this is tashima, a fish that is baked with dough. With him, this is another attempt we tried to recreate with some cooks from Jaffa, one of those very little families that were there for a long, long time. We tried to recreate a festive dinner together. And actually, that's what I'm trying to do in my column, in a way. in the last panel, they were talking about what is Israeli cuisine. And again, I think that maybe Israeli cuisine is quite famous and trendy around the world now, but in Israel, we don't really know how to define it yet. We know to say that there are two major influences. One would be the cuisine that people brought from Jewish communities around the world that had a lot of effect. And the other one would be the local cuisine, whether you would call it Palestinian or Arab or any other name. Again, a cuisine that was consumed by all the people that sat in the land of Israel at that time or before 48. So what I try to do, and I try to bring stories of people that make food, produce food, cook food, but not just, I'm trying not to reduce them to the level of just falafel or hummus or who does it belong to, because this is the least interesting problem. Hummus and falafel, not that it's not a problem, but they of course became symbols of the dispute about the land, and not the question of who invented hummus is not really important for itself. So this is, for example, just to show you how much, you know, when people ask me about the definition of the Israeli cuisine, I'm just saying it's a conflict kitchen. So this, for example, this guy is called Faiz. He's from the market at Fadi Joz. And the interesting thing is, again, we will probably talk a little bit about cultural appropriation later. But this guy this is the market itself. He's coming every week to Tel Aviv, and he brings the vegetables to the most famous chefs in Israel. Yeah, these are vegetables from the West Bank that are very popular and very, you know, all the famous chefs in Israel, Eyal Shani and Chaim Cohen and all these guys cook with them. So on the right side, you can see the zucchini, the baladi zucchini. They talked about the baladi vegetables before in the market. And then what an Israeli chef is making out of them, which is not a traditional course, of course, but this is like in way of improvisation. This is what they do with it. Now, if there's a family that defines the concept of conflict, it's this family. You can see here two brothers, Vadia and Garis. They live in Me'ilia, and they've been doing in an area that is mostly dominated by Muslim and Jews, two things which are remarkable. The first thing is that, you know, they used to raise porks and to make charcuterie out of them. And let me tell you, it's not an easy thing to raise porks in Israel. And the other thing that they do is they make arak, very good arak. Arak, it's anise flavored alcohol. It's like ouzo pernod, one of those. Yeah, it's very good. It's very good, and it's in the center of the tradition of, you know, drinking and eating small plates like the meze in a lot of Mediterranean or cultures. So this guy on the right is one of the people I really love. His name is Yaqub Hayat. He's from a restaurant called Charabik, and he's foraging. He wakes up every morning in 5 o'clock in the morning, and he goes to forage. He has a remarkable knowledge about the things that grow in Israel, the plants and everything. And to the left, you can see a dish that he's making, apropos aubergine and all the discussion about the carpaccio baladi aubergine that Yechiel mentioned. So this is his course. He's making aubergine, like roasts it on open fire, and then he puts on some of these beautiful, the sauce that he's making out of raspberries. And the interesting thing is that if you go to Palomar at London now, the restaurant that is owned by the guys of Machne Yehuda, Chef Asaf Granit, he's serving this dish. Okay, now he's serving this dish. This could be like a classic case of cultural appropriation, but he called it Charabik, like the name of the restaurant of Yaqub. And I asked Yaqub, what do you think about it? Like, he told me that people from the village went to the restaurant. Someone that living in London went to the restaurant and saw it and was horrified. Like, they stole his food, they stole the traditional food, and he said. He called it Charabik, and Charabik, it was a field. He comes from Ikrit, one of the Palestinian villages with the most tragic story that the people who lived there were not allowed to go back to in 48. It's in the Galilee. And he called it after a specific place, a small piece of land that his father owned in Nikrit, and Sharbik means something, you know, like very wild. It won't restrain itself, like very hard land. And he told me they're eating it in London, and they call it Sharbik. They mentioned the name Sharbik in a way it lives on. One story of a lot of conflicts that take place in Israel. Someone was talking yesterday about, please stop me if I'm talking too much. No, you're okay. Someone was talking last night about the olive oil and saying how much, you know, there is more consumption of olive oils and people just want it. This is a very dear friend of mine called Musa. He's from Rama. Rama is one of the places where they still grow olive trees that are very, very ancient. They believe they are 1,000 years old. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if you know it, but it's very hard to put an age on olive trees. They are definitely at least hundreds of years old, and they still grow them without watering them. And it's a special variety that is called Suri, after the place from Lebanon that it was originally from. And this is like, wow, this should have been like, you know, like a cheese from Paris or France or something like that. It's the best olive oil there is. These people have a lot of time, a very hard time to sell it because it has bad reputation in Israel, and it has to do with the conflict itself. Someone was asking yesterday again, someone mentioned the project about the gene banks. So this is one of the biggest projects that take place in Israel nowadays. This is the attempt to bring back to the land of Israel the old varieties of wheat. All the wheat that we consume in Israel these days is modern wheat. And there has been an attempt to bring back the old varieties, which of course raises a lot of questions about who does it belong to, you know, who, the Palestinians, the Jews. It's a very complex, if we'll have time later, maybe I will talk about it a little bit more. If I want to be a little bit optimistic, so one of the most incredible things that I have been researching is the kitchen of cities like Tiberia, Jerusalem, and the holy cities, where Jews, Arabs, and Muslims lived together for hundreds of years. And there was like real fusion in them because people from different places and different regions sat together and did invent some beautiful dishes. That's for the optimistic side.
Well, thank you. And thank you for that overview. I think it's a great setting the table literally for Osama to tell us from a practitioner's point how many generations of cooking he has gone through and what it means in your own kitchen. So Osama's bio is in your book, but he is, you know, a very young and talented chef who owns a restaurant in Tel Aviv. And I'll let you say and follow up Ronit.
Hi, hello everybody. It's very nice to be here. Thanks for everyone that made it possible, and thanks for everyone who talked before me. I'm actually... It's good? Yeah. I'm actually 26 years old. And I started to cook 4 years, maybe 5 years ago. And what I want to do at the beginning, it's just make food, because I feel like have the freedom of to do what I want to do. If I take like, I take the Palestinians' food as an inspiration, but I can take all more ingredients, more technique that I study by visiting Europe, by talking with a neighbor that come from Morocco or a neighbor that come from Polish. It gives me a great technique and opportunity to make our own unique kitchen. That this is the idea when I think right now that when we're talking about Israeli food, I think the base of it, 90%, maybe less, maybe a bit more, it's Palestinians on Arab cuisine. It's a cuisine that was before 48 in this region. But because the internet and the world, it start to be smaller. We are in 2017. We can fly and visit everywhere. We can allow ourselves. I allowed myself to do whatever I want. I will give you an example. I born and live in a city called Akko. It's a 3,000 years old city. And my grandmother lived actually inside the wall. When I mean inside the wall, I mean inside the wall of the city. If you take a look from the window, there's nothing. There's just water, the sea. We was swim there. My uncle was fisherman from there. And when you walk to the house, there is a small, very, very small room to enter the house. It was near to the window, and always was there onion and garlic that my grandmother put to dry in the season. And as a children, we was licking the wall because it was salty, and the aroma of the garlic and the onion was great. And I make a dish inspired by that. I make a custard from onion and garlic. Custard, it's nothing that considered to be an Arabic food, an Akko food, an Israeli food. But the flavor that I use flavor that I know, and I put a lot of sea salt inside to make the effect as we remember to lick the wall and have a very nice salty flavor and the aroma of the garlic and the onion. After I finish the custard, I put a bit fried khubeza. Khubeza, it's a wild herb that can grow at the autumn. It's very easy to do actually. You just cut it with some fennel and extra virgin olive oil and onion, and you fry it. And it's so good and it's so healthy for you. You should try it. I put it up on the custard and I fry a small shrimp, and I season it with my grandmother Ras al Hanout. It's a mix of spices. For me, it was Akko food as it can be, because it was mainly as a memory and flavor, but the technique, it was a bit French, let's say. What is very, for me, I had the freedom. But when I look to Palestinian-Israeli conflicts about food, I think one of the only things that the Palestinians still have, it's the gava, the pride about the food. It's something that they still of their nationality, that still didn't become globalized or Israeli. This is something that also common between the Arab that live inside Israel and the Palestinians that live outside of Israel. For me, I born as a Palestinian and live as an Israeli. I got lucky to be who I am. I got lucky to have a friend that are Arab or Jew or Christian and Muslim. I really want and think if we will know each other, maybe my mother, or the most important thing for my mother than food is to sit around the table. If you don't hungry, don't eat, but sit around the table. And this is the unique time that was a conversation that we can talk about school, about experience, about, you know, when you're talking and eating, it's easier than to talk one-on-one, and you feel as a teenager or as a child, you are in an investigation. And I want to take this idea and think if we sit around the table and we know each other more and we recognize our similarity than our differences, it will be better. To be an Israeli kitchen, I think it needs to be, maybe I'm also optimistic a little bit. To be an Israeli kitchen, it needs to be first, I think, peace between Israel and Palestine, because then you can say, one second, I will come back to that. For me, when the word talking about Israeli cuisine, he talked about falafel, hummus, shakshuka, all of the things. For me, as an Arab, I never thought about that as a cuisine or as a food that it's unique, because it was always to be, you know, darling, I didn't get lunch today. Go have a falafel and come back, do your homework. It was like, you know, it's the junk food. It doesn't represent anything about this unique culture. When I opened my restaurant, I thought that my responsibility is to bring the Arabic kitchen, the Arabic Palestinian Akoian kitchen. There is to create actually a new way of thinking, that you have the fantastic home cooking food that are the Arab cook in house, but you cannot see a really good representing about Arab food and Arab philosophy of food and restaurant. You saw the hummus, you saw the falafel, but never, you can see that now at the 5 years. A lot actually of Israeli Jewish chef like Eyal Shani, Yair Yosefi. I love his work, you should try it also. Erez Komarovsky, they come back and say, guys, this is a Palestinian cuisine, but with our touch as a chef. This is I can respect. This is I can relate to, because today, when I thinking about chef, I don't think our job is to be at the kitchen, you know, and yell for our and cook and say do that and do that. No, I think the new chef of today, it's he combine, he make the word smaller. It's easier. Wow, ברח לי. לפתור. Yes. It's easier to solve a problem, maybe for me, inside a plate than to sit with another people and have an argument. And that's all. Thank you.
Osama, just why don't you stay here, and if the other panelists will join us, I think you're talking about, I think it doesn't, we can move the names. Laura can help us move the names. Thank you. So I think it would be great to start the conversation from a point that you just made, Osama, about building peace one plate at a time, to moving to the complexities of arguments that we've heard on this panel, from Israelis wanting to be Italians but being 1,500 miles away because of the enemy that surrounds them, to the kinds of things that you were talking about, Ronald, about eating in Israel needing to be affordable and accessible and globalized, but that the connotation for food that it belongs to an Arab culture is considered cheap. And in fact, I mean, we share similarities in the United States. For years, the column about ethnic foods in Washington used to be called Cheap Eats, until that name was changed to provide a respectful recognition that different ethnicities' foods had their own cultural values. But I guess I'd like to start off a question, because I think we should get to some of the issues that people have raised earlier, is you've all given us different contours of a conflict as it relates to the culinary situation in Israel. But if you can put your pragmatic hat on as opposed to optimist or pessimist, where do you see the food movement going? Ronit, you talked about the third generation of Israelis recognizing the value and searching for the roots, both roots. How is this having an impact on perhaps the broader political environment? Or if maybe it's not.
That's one of the things that Ronald said, which is the problem. There's a duality, you know, in a way. Arabic or Palestinian cuisine is desirable in a way because it's authentic, because it is the land of Israel and the local ingredients are easier to deal with. On the other hand, it doesn't help in any other aspect, you know, it doesn't help that food is like that. Israelis were easy and good middlemen for Mediterranean cuisine around the world. I think this is what upsets sometimes Palestinians about the fact that these dishes, that this heritage is considered to be Israeli and not Palestinians. In terms of what happened in the general aspects, I don't know if well, this is one of the things that really frustrates me, you know, that the process is the same. Palestinian people and Jewish Israeli people are trying to find their roots through food, but yet it doesn't help to the conversation between them, I think.
So,
anything you want to add to that?
Okay, just very, very briefly, I think food has the potential to bridge gaps because it's seen as many as apolitical. But I think it's very difficult in Israel to bridge these gaps because I think for many Israelis, the recognition of a Palestinian people with equal rights, with the right to self-determination, is very problematic because it has further implications. So while they might be willing to consider, at least at the first stage, the food is something they share, what that means or where this leads to, I think it's something many would not want to engage with, at least not just yet.
Yeah. And we talked about it before among us, that, you know, the word itself, Palestinian, in Haaretz you can write Palestinian kitchen. In other newspapers in Israel you wouldn't. And I've been consulting to a program in Channel 10 in the Israeli television now, and you know, you can't say Palestinian food in primetime television in Israel. So in a way, saying Palestinian is like Ronald say, that you acknowledge that there are this kind of people, and then that they deserve rights. Okay. You say Arabic, you say Oriental. For a long, long time, Arabic restaurants in Israel were called Oriental, Mizrahi restaurants, and now you say Arab. Maybe that's an advance, you know. Maybe, like he said, that we do go towards better situation, but you don't say Palestinian other than in it on ours, I think.
So I want to ask just from a millennial point of view, since you're our youngest panelist, and millennials usually have the most open approach to integrating into society. As a mother of a millennial, they're less prejudiced, they don't carry the burden that our generation has. People come to your restaurant because of your Palestinian roots. They come to taste the food that you cook. How do you see your role in this effort to delegitimize what is considered Palestinian food, and you're legitimizing it through a beautiful restaurant?
At the beginning, I didn't thought about myself cooking any type of food, you know, but I was inspired. But after the first and the second journalist to come to my restaurant, and they give me the title. And I didn't understand it in the beginning as an Arabic restaurant or a Palestinian Arabic restaurant. The name of my first restaurant was tapas bar. Actually, I never thought about. But I say I want the people. Yeah, I want the people that they have the experience as a tapas bar restaurant, but the flavor come from Arabic recipe. What was the question again?
You're a millennial. I think your answer, the way you answered your question demonstrates the fact that you do not come with the cultural baggage. So my question is that I thought it was very interesting whether you were doing the taxonomy of food, which you did, and the different stages, or whether you were talking about generations. You're the youngest generation. You're an Israeli citizen of Palestinian roots. I mean, how do you see the situation as far as using food as a tool to integrate? Is this something that is going to, by people coming to your restaurant, is your generation going to be more optimistic, more willing to accept the differences and not call Arab food cheap eats?
I think yes, and I think more than that, that we have, as a new generation chef, have the opportunity to move emotion with people that, like I give you an example. I had a dish called kusa mahshi. It's a stuffed zucchini with a lamb ragu and a yogurt sauce, a hot yogurt sauce. It's great, actually. And I there's a lot of Jews that come to my restaurant just to eat this dish because they said to me, my grandmother was making this dish, and you make this dish in the same way almost. I can feel her, I can taste her, and this is the biggest compliment that I imagine I ever had. And after these two sentences, the discourse will it's open it, and you can talk about everything, and there is not the after people connect. I think from my experience, after people connect with food, they put the politics a bit on the side, and the conversation, it's more real. That's what I get from my guest or from my customer that come to eat the Palestinian region cuisine, and he is from Syria, and he's from Lebanon, he's from Turkey, and it was great.
Please. So can you just, I think this is the only mic that's working.
So I am a social scientist. I am interested in food, but food for me is a lens to look at society. And I've been working most of my academic life on food in Vietnam and then in Israel. But for me, the focus is a little different, not the food itself. So I'm listening to Osama saying that, people come and they taste their grandmother in your food. And I'm sure that you are right in describing that. But there is structure above that, and the structure is very powerful. So I saw this lady sitting here, and when you said that you cannot say Palestinian food in Channel 10, she said, so what do you say? What do you say? Yes? So you understand that there are, if there is Palestinian food, it means that there is Palestinian culture. It means that there is Palestinian people. For many Israelis, this is a big problem. The acknowledgement is impossible. And this is exactly what Ronald said. So talking about responsibilities, as you mentioned before, you ask Osama about responsibility. I want to turn the table upside down, if I may. Whenever I speak to an American audience, and especially when there is a lot of Jews present, I think that I also have a responsibility. There is a big problem with the support that Israel gets from American Jewry, because you support us no matter what we do. And this is, I have 5 children, I'm telling you, this is not the right way to treat children. Yes? So we from the colonies, that's, when you said that, I suddenly realized what happened, We from the colonies, we all came because we were summoned to the center. So we are here at the center, but I'm telling you, you also have responsibility in all of these. You should support us when we are behaving according to what you believe is right, and when we are not doing this, it's okay for you to say, well, hold on, something is going wrong. Now let me give you the Israeli perspective, okay? 70 to 80% of Israelis repeatedly in all the polls, they want a two-state solution. And so are the Palestinians, 70 to 80%. We have 20% of extremists, Jews and Arabs, and the tail wings the dog. And the politicians are locked in this situation too. And when Obama was elected, I told my wife, that's it. He's going to solve the problem. It didn't happen. So yeah, maybe Donald Trump will solve the problem. Who knows? Who knows? But instead of looking, I realize now that American presidents, they don't rule like Israeli prime ministers don't rule. Yes, but we all have responsibility. And I think that Osama, 26 years old, Israeli Palestinian, asking him for responsibility, this is not possible. So the responsibility has to do with age, with hegemony, with us, and with you. Yeah, thank you.
So, Nir, I was only asking for responsibility for his cuisine.
It's not a critique of you.
Oh, I'm not taking it personally.
No, I use the moment.
And you used it well, and I think now the moment belongs to the people, and I think we should open this up to questions because there are a lot of hands, and you've been all very wonderful and provocative. So I saw a hand over here. Let's start on
And
my
students
left.
first, always, if we have any
Okay, I'm
student
sorry.
questions.
Okay. Sorry, I missed you.
Thank you. Hi, Katie Lundy, master's student here. I've got a question for all four of you, but I guess starting with Osama, how has socioeconomic status of people coming into your restaurant, how has that been similar or different? Have you seen a large difference in socioeconomic status? And how has the intersectionality of those coming to your restaurant played out? Thank you.
Okay, this is not an easy question because 95, maybe more % of the people that come to my restaurant and the experience that I give are, I will say it in Hebrew, and I hope that you can help me with that. זה קהל אשכנזי אליטיסטי.
Ashkenazi crowd, audience. He's saying that 95% of the people who come to his restaurants are Ashkenazi origin, elitistic crowd.
Haaretz readers.
Haaretz reader mainly. Yeah. And and the New Yorkers. In Akko, I mean, this is in Tel Aviv. In Akko, it was a bit different, but it's also was 95% Tel Aviv that come to Akko just to have a lunch and come back. But they was also in the same reference.
In terms of answering that question, I think we need to differentiate between the kind of new modern Arab and Palestinian restaurants like Osama is opening, which that kind of crowd normally goes to more cheap like hummusiyas or hummuseries, which are dominated mainly by Arabs, which many Israelis, even working class Israelis, would go to, but they would not think about it as a political act. It will be completely depoliticized because for them, hummus is hummus and it means nothing, even if cooked by an Arab.
And you have to remember also that the whole scene of fine dining in Israel actually collapsed. There's and one of the reasons it happened is because there's such a little crowd for them. This would be a very small percentages of the people in Israel. And unlike other countries that can rely on tourists, it's hard to rely on tourists in Israel, where you've got war practically every year in the last couple of years. So there are not a lot of tourists. A lot of 3-star Michelin restaurants and everything thrive in the world because they have tourists. Locals don't go to them. In Israel, it's not like that. Fine dining is really collapsing at the moment. Street food is the new king. And a complex thing like Osama is doing are not very common, of course. And I just wanted to say something about the thing that we said before, that we have to remember that one of the biggest criticism against food as being the only bridge, and this is what happens in Israel now, you know, when you talk about relations between Arab and Jews, so hummus and falafel always come up. And in other areas, like I said before, the education systems or culture, other cultural aspect, it doesn't happen. So this is where a lot of the criticism go to in terms of this.
So we're going to look for some more students, if they had their hands up first. Okay.
Some older
Okay.
students here.
We got a student.
Mature students.
Alumni.
Hi everyone, I'm Cameron Kushner. I'm a senior in the School of International Service here. My question is mainly directed toward Ronald, but anyone who has insight is welcome to answer. I'm wondering if any of your research has conducted you to look at Palestinian diaspora communities and how their nationality has kind of been promoted through culinary lessons, schools, anything to really kind of keep the Palestinian cuisine going in the diaspora. Thank you.
While my research has not been on that, there's actually a lot of research on Palestinian diaspora and the importance of food as one of the main kind of indicators. If you think a lot of Palestinian writing, one of the main things in writing is what happens when someone comes from Palestine to the diaspora on a visit. Like Samuel Natur wrote about the fact that they would bring za'atar to the relatives as a kind of a sign of importance and the connection between themselves and Palestine. I think also in the issue of food, another interesting thing with Palestinian diaspora has been online and social media campaigns about the importance of recognizing Palestinian food and the battle between ownership of different food items, whether it's knafe or falafel or hummus.
And I would just add to that, imagine that you were an Israeli Palestinian going abroad and in your suitcase you'd have 1 kilo of za'atar. And what would happen to you at the airport? And I've seen it 100 times, you know. So it can either be weed or explosive, yes, but something is wrong with the, yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question. It seems like we're having a one-way conversation, really. Is there any reciprocal conversation, any reciprocal research, any reciprocal reaching out by Palestinians? I don't mean Palestinians so much as Israeli Arabs. Let's just keep it, the Palestinian Arabs in Israel, to Israel, from a culinary perspective. In other words, are there Israeli Arabs who are interested in some kind of outreach to Israeli restaurants, or who want to do what you are all talking about, going the other way? Are they reaching out to you? Are there people in Arab universities studying Israeli cuisine? Do you understand my question?
I think I'll answer very briefly, but I think Ronit can give more examples, and I'm sure Osama can say something about that. Most Arab chefs in Israel started their life as a chefs in Israeli restaurants. So there's a huge connection there. And if you think about culinary in terms of food, a lot of Arab food in Israel, or Palestinian food in Israel, has been influenced by their encounter with Jews. Think about schnitzel as now as a kind of a cultural implant in Palestinian kitchens. So there definitely is a connection, but I think because the power dynamics are so different, I think it's not as important for us to look at the other side of this debate. It's almost as asking, in most settler colonial societies, has the indigenous taken on some of those who colonized them? Of course they have. And of course, in a way, there's this duality of being the constant encounter with Israelis. And it's always there.
Yeah, there are not a lot of examples. There are. I just talked to Ronald this morning about, in East Jerusalem, one of the most common breakfasts these days is what we call Jerusalem bagel, which is ka'ak in Arabic. And they put falafel inside and some cream, sour cream. So sour cream definitely came after 67. It's not part of the, so there is an influence. But again, like Ronald said, because of the power relations, most of the time it's the other way around. But there is definitely a mutual influence. We hold so much panels about hummus in Israel, trying to understand why we're so obsessed with hummus and what are the origins and everything. And things do change. Arab restaurant also changed some things in their hummus because of the Jewish influence. But mostly it's the other way around.
Gentleman in the red
Yeah, Osama, I'm interested in, my name's Roger Sherman. I'm going to show a film in a few minutes. I'm interested in what you and your friends talk about, and do you talk about politics? We are in a time in this country that is so politically charged that when we go out to dinner with friends, we often say, we can't talk about politics, or that's all we will talk about for the entire night, and we will be so depressed. So do you all talk politics? Do you just roll your eyes and say, forget, I mean, sort of beyond food?
Pass the microphone.
I have one friend actually that I talk with him about politics. He's my neighbor in Tel Aviv. He's called Ori. And no, we don't talk a lot about politics. Maybe me, if I take myself as example, I always feel afraid from politics. I always feel it's not a very comfortable zone that I want to be on it. I feel that I have the privilege because, you know, I look, I'm a white kid and I don't have any accents, and I have the privilege like to live almost regular life. That's what התחבאתי, hide from that. I didn't want to be any part of them that. But yeah, sometimes we can talk about politics, but it's not a big part of my life.
So I wish we could take more questions. The speakers will be available after this session and will be around. This has been a fascinating conversation, which I can see no one wants to stop, but the clock is our enemy at this point. So why don't we thank these superb panelists.